The cold hit different in Utah Territory's high desert valleys. Thomas Wakefield learned that his first winter in Fountain Green in 1876, when ice formed inside his cabin walls and his water bucket froze solid just 3 feet from the roaring iron stove. He had built his cabin exactly like every other settler in San Pete County was told to build it. Thin log walls, big windows for light, cast iron stove burning constantly, standard and trusted. By spring, he had burned through nearly 5 cords of wood and still woke to freezing rooms most mornings. Across the valley, pioneer families were fighting the same losing battle in houses built by the book and failing every winter night. Over the next 2 years, Thomas quietly shifted to a technique borrowed from older building traditions and created a cottage that stayed warm through harsh nights while burning barely half the fuel. What did he understand about heat and thick earthen walls that every serious homesteader in cold country should know? Fountain Green sat in the heart of San Pete County's high valley, perched on the edge of the Great Basin desert, where winter nights could plunge 20 degrees below freezing, even when afternoon sun warmed the sagebrush. The settlement had grown from a handful of dugouts in the 1860s to a proper town by the mid-1870s, complete with a sawmill, a brickyard, and families eager to leave their cramped earth shelters for houses that looked like progress. Most had followed the same path Thomas took, first a dugout or hasty log cabin, then a move toward what territorial newspapers called a cheerful home with ample windows, generous rooms, and the kind of sawn lumber construction that marked a family as successful. The timber came dear. Pine and juniper grew scattered through the nearby canyons, but the good wood had to be hauled from higher elevations over rough mountain tracks that turned treacherous with the first snow. Mining operations at nearby settlements consumed whole forests for shoring timbers and smelter fuel, while bridge building and public construction projects drove prices higher each season. A cord of seasoned firewood represented days of cutting, splitting, and freighting, and most families needed 4 to 6 cords to heat a standard frame house through a Great Basin winter. Yet the accepted wisdom pushed settlers toward exactly the kind of construction that devoured fuel. Territorial building guides and traveling carpenters preached that a proper American home needed big single-pane windows on multiple walls to admit light and air, room sizes generous enough for furniture and gatherings, and walls built light and fast so families could move out of their dugouts before the next winter set in. The assumption was simple. Any heat losses could be overcome by a large cast iron stove burning steadily from October through April. The reality proved harsher. Across Fountain Green and similar high desert settlements, families found themselves prisoners in their own kitchens each winter, clustering around cook stoves while their front rooms and upper floors became uninhabitable ice boxes. Children developed persistent coughs in bedrooms that never warmed above freezing. Water froze in wash basins sitting mere feet from roaring fires. One neighbor's balloon frame house, built wide and proud with floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides, nearly broke the family when a particularly brutal cold snap in 1878 stretched longer than their wood supply could handle. They ended up burning furniture and fence posts to keep from freezing, while drafts through warped window sashes made the house feel more like a barn than a home. Thomas Wakefield had arrived in Fountain Green as a young man in his mid-20s, carrying farming experience from Illinois and enough capital to marry Maria Johnson, daughter of the town's founder. His background gave him a different perspective on building than many of his neighbors possessed. Back in Illinois, he had seen how solid brick and stone houses around iron stoves held their warmth far better than the thin-walled frame farmhouses that dotted the prairie. The substantial masonry absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly through cold nights, requiring less constant firing to maintain comfort. More importantly, Fountain Green's population included Danish immigrants who had settled as part of San Pete County's Little Scandinavia. These families brought building traditions from Northern Europe, where compact cottages with thick walls and modest openings were standard responses to harsh winters. One Danish mason told Thomas directly that the American obsession with large rooms and many windows made no sense in a climate where fuel was scarce and expensive. In Denmark, he explained, sensible people built small and solid then used the money saved on lumber to invest in better land or livestock. Thomas also paid attention to what the region's indigenous inhabitants had learned over generations of winter survival. Ute and Paiute families constructed seasonal shelters using thick layers of brush, bark, and grass, sometimes reinforced with mud, that created effective barriers against Great Basin cold. These structures were deliberately compact and oriented away from prevailing winds, with openings that could be sealed tight when temperatures dropped and opened for ventilation when needed. The builders understood that thickness and controlled airflow mattered more than size or appearance when survival was at stake. By 1876, Thomas had developed a working theory that ran counter to everything his neighbors believed about proper construction. Instead of building large to appear prosperous, he would build small and dense. Instead of using thin lumber walls that heated quickly but lost heat just as fast, he would use thick adobe bricks from the local yard to create walls that could store and slowly release warmth. Instead of placing his stove against an exterior wall where much of its heat would radiate outdoors, he would center it in the house plan so every bit of warmth stayed inside the envelope. The plan called for a main floor of under 600 square feet, comprising one living room and an adjoining kitchen, with an attic bedroom accessible by a simple ladder. The stone-walled cellar would sit beneath the kitchen, providing cold storage for food while moderating the floor temperature above. Most radical of all, the walls would rise from a stone foundation in thick adobe, roughly 12 inches deep, creating a thermal mass that could absorb heat during the day and release it gradually through the night. The reaction from neighbors and suppliers was swift and dismissive. Several called adobe poor man's material and suggested Thomas was building a Mexican hut rather than a respectable American home. The local lumber merchant warned that thick mud walls would hurt the property's resale value and urged Thomas to buy proper boards and be done with it. A teamster who specialized in freighting building materials joked that Thomas was hauling rocks and mud like an Indian instead of investing in real construction materials that would last. Even some of Thomas's Danish neighbors questioned the wisdom of such a radical departure from accepted practice. While they agreed that American building habits wasted fuel, they worried that an all-adobe house might not withstand the region's freeze-thaw cycles or spring snowmelt without expensive maintenance. The local Mormon bishop, whose own large frame house consumed enormous amounts of firewood each winter, suggested that Thomas's plan showed a lack of faith in the territory's economic future. Thomas pressed forward despite the criticism, convinced that the combination of indigenous climate wisdom, immigrant building craft, and his own practical experience pointed toward a better solution than the fuel-hungry standard. The question was whether thick earthen walls and compact rooms could actually deliver the warmth and comfort that his neighbors achieved only by burning wood constantly. Winter would provide the test. Construction began in late spring of 1876. With Thomas hauling adobe bricks from the Fountain Green yard, where local clay was mixed with sand and chopped straw, then molded in wooden forms and sun-dried until hard enough to stack. Each brick measured roughly 4 inches by 8 inches by 16 inches and weighed close to 30 pounds when fully cured. The bricklayers laid them in running bond like conventional masonry, but instead of the single withe walls common in frame construction, Thomas specified walls running 12 to 14 inches thick from foundation to roof plate. The Danish mason, who had encouraged Thomas's approach, helped establish the wall thickness through practical trial. In Denmark, he explained, winter cottages use stone or brick walls thick enough that a man could barely reach from one side to the other with his arm extended. The principle was simple but critical. Thin walls responded quickly to temperature changes, heating fast but cooling just as rapidly, while thick walls changed temperature slowly and stored large amounts of heat or cold depending on the season. In the Great Basin's climate, where sunny days could warm the air 40 degrees above the nighttime low, this thermal lag became a powerful tool. The foundation work revealed another crucial element that neighbors had overlooked. Instead of setting the adobe directly on grade as many rushed builders did, Thomas excavated a full basement beneath the kitchen area and lined it with local sandstone laid in lime mortar. The stone walls extended 18 inches above grade, creating a dry platform for the adobe, while the below-grade portion formed a root cellar that would moderate the floor temperature above. This underground chamber would never freeze solid even in the coldest weather, and its thermal mass would prevent the kitchen floor from conducting winter cold up from the frozen ground. The stove placement broke completely with standard frontier practice. Where cook stoves were typically pushed against exterior walls to simplify chimney construction and keep cooking heat away from living areas. Thomas positioned his iron range near the center of the compact floor plan, with the chimney rising through the middle of the house rather than up an outside wall. This meant that every bit of heat radiating from the stove body and chimney stayed inside the building envelope instead of warming the outdoor air. The central chimney also provided a warm core for the attic bedroom directly above the kitchen, where the brick flue would radiate stored heat through cold nights. The first winter provided immediate proof that thermal mass behaved fundamentally differently than thin construction. In November, when outside temperatures began dropping below freezing regularly, Thomas and Maria established a heating routine that seemed impossibly modest to their neighbors. Each evening, they built a substantial fire in the cook stove and maintained it through dinner preparation and the early evening hours. By bedtime, the adobe walls felt noticeably warm to the touch, having absorbed heat from the interior air throughout the day. The critical test came on the coldest nights, when outdoor temperatures plunged 15 to 20 degrees below freezing. In standard frame houses around Fountain Green, families reported that their interior temperatures dropped within a few degrees of the outdoor air once the fire died down, forcing them to keep stoves burning through the night or wake to frozen water buckets and visible breath indoors. Thomas's cottage behaved completely differently. Even when the stove fire died to cold ashes before dawn, the thick adobe walls continued releasing their stored warmth into the interior air. Maria kept careful notes on indoor conditions that first winter, measuring temperatures with a mercury thermometer placed on the kitchen table away from direct stove heat. On the coldest January mornings, when the outdoor air measured 18 degrees below freezing, the cottage interior before rekindling the fire typically held steady around 28 to 30 degrees above freezing. Water in buckets remained liquid, though sometimes with a thin skin of ice on top. More importantly, the family could use their entire floor area comfortably, not just cluster around the stove as neighbors were forced to do. The fuel savings proved even more dramatic than Thomas had hoped. Where comparable frame houses in Fountain Green typically burned 4 to 6 cords of wood per winter, the cottage family found they could heat comfortably with 2.5 to 3 cords of seasoned pine and juniper. The difference represented 30 to 50 hours less labor cutting and hauling wood, plus significant cost savings when purchased fuel was needed. Even more valuable, the reduced firing schedule freed Thomas from the constant tending that wood stoves typically demanded, allowing more time for farm work and other productive activities. The thermal mass effect became most apparent during the daily heating cycle. Unlike thin-walled houses that warmed quickly but required constant firing to maintain temperature, the cottage warmed slowly through the morning, but held that heat well into the evening. The walls acted like a massive battery, charging up during active firing periods and discharging stored energy for hours afterward. This meant that a single substantial firing in early evening could carry the family through until the next morning's rekindling, eliminating the middle-of-the-night stoking that many frontier families endured. The stone cellar added another layer of thermal stability that proved crucial for food storage and overall comfort. Root vegetables, preserved meats, and dairy products stored in the underground chamber never froze solid even during the harshest cold snaps, while the moderated temperature prevented spoilage that plagued families whose storage areas swung between freezing and above-ground heat. The cellar's steady temperature also meant the kitchen floor above never became uncomfortably cold. Unlike houses built directly on grade where floor surfaces often felt like ice on winter mornings. By spring of 1877, the performance gap between Thomas's cottage and standard construction had become impossible to ignore. Neighbors who had mocked the mud brick approach began asking detailed questions about wall thickness, foundation design, and stove placement. The most vocal critic, a lumber merchant who had predicted the adobe would crumble, was forced to acknowledge that the walls showed no signs of deterioration while his own frame house had required expensive repairs to warped siding and shifted foundations caused by repeated freeze-thaw cycles. The cottage had proven that in the Great Basin's harsh climate, mass and modest fuel use could deliver better comfort than thin construction and heavy firing. The thick earthen walls had transformed a small house into an efficient heat storage system that worked with natural daily temperature cycles instead of fighting them constantly. The cottage's successful first winter had proven the power of thermal mass, but Thomas soon discovered that thick walls alone were not enough to control interior climate year-round. The challenge became apparent during the hot summer of 1877, when Sanpete Valley temperatures climbed above 90 degrees and the cottage's small windows failed to provide adequate cross-ventilation. While neighbors in frame houses opened every window and door to create cooling breezes, the cottage's modest openings left the family sweltering in air that felt trapped and stagnant. The solution came from an unexpected teacher. A Ute man named Joseph, who worked seasonally on nearby ranches, had observed Thomas's building project with interest, recognizing similarities between the cottage's compact design and the winter lodges his people constructed in the high country. During a conversation at the Fountain Green Trading Post, Joseph explained how tribal builders oriented their seasonal shelters to work with prevailing wind patterns rather than against them. Summer wickiups, he said, were positioned to catch cooling breezes from specific directions, with openings designed to create airflow that would flush hot air out while drawing cooler air in. Joseph's knowledge proved immediately practical. He pointed out that Fountain Green's location in the valley created predictable wind patterns, with cooler air flowing down from the mountain canyons during evening hours and warmer air rising from the desert floor during the day. The cottage's windows had been placed for interior convenience and exterior symmetry, ignoring these natural air currents that could be harnessed for cooling. More importantly, Joseph explained, the timing of opening and closing those windows mattered as much as their placement. Following Joseph's guidance, Thomas began experimenting with a daily ventilation schedule that treated the cottage's thermal mass as a cooling tool rather than just a heating system. The key insight was that the thick adobe walls could store coolness just as effectively as they stored warmth, but only if the timing was precisely controlled. Each evening at sunset, when the outside air began cooling faster than the interior, Thomas opened the cottage's east and west windows wide to create cross-ventilation that would flush the day's accumulated heat out of the rooms and draw cool night air through the structure. This night-flushing routine required discipline that went against frontier instincts about fresh air and security. Most families kept their windows open constantly during hot weather, which meant their houses never had a chance to cool below the daily average temperature. Thomas instead closed all windows at sunrise before the outside air began warming, and kept them sealed throughout the hot daylight hours. The cottage's thick walls, now charged with coolness from the night air, would moderate interior temperatures even as the sun blazed outside. The cooling effect proved dramatic during the valley's hottest days. While frame houses with thin walls and constant ventilation often reached interior temperatures within a few degrees of the outside peak, the cottage maintained indoor air roughly 10 to 15 degrees cooler than the afternoon highs. The attic bedroom, which had been nearly unusable during early summer heat waves, became comfortable enough for sleeping once the night flush routine was established. Thomas refined the airflow system further by installing simple wooden shutters on the cottage's main windows. Unlike the decorative shutters common on eastern houses, these were working tools designed to control both heat and light. During winter months, the shutters would be closed at dusk to trap warm air against the glass and reduce radiant heat loss to the cold night sky. During summer, they provided shade during the hottest part of the day while still allowing the night flush ventilation to work effectively. The shutter system also solved a persistent winter problem that had emerged during the cottage's first cold season. Even with the thermal mass keeping interior air above freezing, the windows themselves became cold surfaces that radiated uncomfortable chills into the living space. Thomas had noticed that the family instinctively avoided sitting near windows on cold evenings, reducing the usable area of their already compact rooms. The wooden shutters created an insulating airspace between the interior and the glass, making window seats comfortable even on the coldest nights. Maria developed additional techniques for managing moisture and air quality that complemented the thermal and ventilation systems. She discovered that the cottage's tight construction and controlled ventilation could trap cooking moisture and other indoor humidity, leading to condensation on windows and a stuffy feeling during extended cold spells. Her solution was to briefly open windows during mid-morning hours when the sun had warmed the outside air, but before the day's heat peaked, creating a controlled air exchange that removed excess moisture without dumping stored thermal energy. The seasonal transition periods required the most careful management, when heating and cooling needs could change dramatically within a single day. During spring and fall, Thomas developed a routine of monitoring both indoor and outdoor temperatures with a mercury thermometer, adjusting window openings and shutter positions throughout the day to optimize comfort. This active management turned the cottage into a responsive system rather than a passive structure, with the family's daily habits becoming as important as the building's physical design. By the end of the cottage's second year, the integrated thermal mass and airflow control system had proven capable of maintaining comfortable interior conditions year-round with minimal fuel input. Winter fuel consumption remained at 3 cords or less, while summer comfort exceeded that of much larger houses. The cottage required more daily attention than a conventional house, with its schedules for opening and closing windows, adjusting shutters, and managing ventilation, but this active operation delivered superior performance in both seasons. The success attracted visitors from other Great Basin settlements facing similar climate challenges. A group of Mormon pioneers planning a new settlement in Nevada visited specifically to observe the cottage's ventilation routines and shutter operations. They noted particularly how the night flush cooling technique could be applied to adobe construction in even hotter, drier climates where summer heat was a greater challenge than winter cold. Thomas documented his seasonal operating procedures in a detailed journal that would later guide other builders. The winter routine called for opening windows briefly at mid-morning for air exchange, then closing and shuttering them until the next day's warming period. The summer routine reversed this pattern, with wide-open night ventilation followed by sealed, shaded conditions during daylight hours. Spring and fall required daily judgment calls based on weather conditions and the thermal state of the walls. The cottage had evolved from a simple, thick-walled house into a climate-responsive system that used both thermal mass and controlled airflow to maintain comfort across the full range of Great Basin weather. But this success would face its greatest test when a particularly harsh winter would challenge every aspect of Thomas's integrated approach. The cottage's third spring brought an unexpected threat that revealed a critical weakness in Thomas's design. Heavy snowmelt combined with unusual late-season rains created standing water throughout Fountain Green, and Thomas watched with growing alarm as an adobe garden wall he had built the previous summer began to crumble at its base. The lower courses of sun-dried brick had absorbed ground moisture through capillary action, and when the saturated adobe went through repeated freeze-thaw cycles, the expanding ice crystals destroyed the clay bonds that held the blocks together. The failure taught Thomas that adobe's greatest enemy was not cold or heat, but water in the wrong place at the wrong time. Unlike the cottage, which sat on its elevated stone foundation, the garden wall had been built directly on grade with only a thin layer of gravel beneath the first course. Ground moisture had wicked up into the adobe like water climbing a sponge, saturating the lower blocks until they lost structural integrity. Thomas realized that his cottage's stone foundation was not just a convenience, but a critical protective barrier that had to be maintained and improved. The lesson became urgent when a traveling mason from southern Utah visited Fountain Green that summer. Miguel Santos had learned adobe construction in New Mexico before moving north to work on Mormon settlements, and he carried knowledge of building techniques refined over generations in the Southwest. Santos took one look at the cottage's exterior walls and shook his head. The adobe blocks, he explained, were excellent for thermal mass, but dangerously vulnerable to weather without proper protection. In the desert settlements where he had learned his trade, no adobe wall survived long without a protective plaster skin and careful water management. Santos demonstrated the traditional southwestern approach to adobe protection, starting with an analysis of how water moved around buildings. Rain and snowmelt, he explained, attacked adobe walls in three ways: from below through capillary rise from damp ground, from above through direct wetting by precipitation, and from the sides through splash and runoff. Each required a different defensive strategy, and all three had to work together, or the system would fail. The cottage's stone foundation provided good protection against capillary rise, but Santos recommended raising the grade around the building to improve drainage away from the walls. Using picks and shovels, Thomas and Santos created a gentle slope that carried surface water away from the foundation in all directions, preventing pooling that could saturate the ground near the walls. They also dug shallow trenches lined with stones to intercept runoff from the roof and direct it toward the garden areas rather than letting it pool against the building. The roof presented a more complex challenge. While the cottage's eaves extended about 18 inches beyond the wall plane, Santos argued this was insufficient for reliable weather protection in a climate with driving snow and seasonal thunderstorms. Together, they extended the eaves another 12 inches by adding brackets and additional rafters, creating overhangs that would shade the walls from summer sun while throwing rain and snowmelt well clear of the adobe surface. The most critical improvement was the application of a lime-based plaster system that would create a sacrificial weather barrier over the structural adobe core. Santos had brought bags of lime from southern Utah settlements where it was burned in kilns for construction use. The lime was slaked with water to create lime putty, then mixed with local sand and a small amount of chopped straw to create a workable plaster that could be troweled onto the adobe walls in multiple coats. The first coat, called the scratch coat, was applied roughly to create a mechanical bond with the adobe surface and allowed to cure for several days until it reached initial hardness. The second coat went on smoother and was worked with a wooden float to create a uniform surface that would accept the final finish. The finish coat included additional lime and was polished with a steel trowel to create a hard surface that would shed water while still allowing the wall to breathe. Santos explained that lime plaster created a chemical reaction as it cured, forming calcium carbonate crystals that became harder with age and exposure to carbon dioxide from the air. This mineral skin would protect the adobe from direct wetting while allowing water vapor to move through the wall, preventing the moisture buildup that could lead to freeze damage or structural problems. The plaster could be patched and renewed as needed, but the adobe core would remain sound for decades if kept dry. The plastering work required careful timing and technique that Thomas had to learn through trial and correction. The lime mixture had to be applied while still workable, but not so wet that it would slump off the wall. Each coat required proper curing time in damp conditions to develop strength, which meant covering the work with wet canvas during hot weather and protecting it from freezing during cold snaps. Santos taught Thomas to recognize the subtle color changes and surface texture that indicated proper curing. The finished plaster system transformed the cottage's appearance from rough adobe blocks to smooth white walls that reflected summer heat while providing weather protection. More importantly, it created a complete water management system that worked from foundation to roof peak. Water hitting the plastered walls would run down to the stone foundation, then be carried away by the improved grading and drainage ditches. Snow loading on the extended eaves would melt and drip harmlessly away from the walls rather than running down the adobe surface. The investment in water protection proved wise during the cottage's fourth winter, when alternating periods of heavy snow and warm Chinook winds created challenging freeze-thaw conditions throughout the valley. Several unprotected adobe structures in Fountain Green showed damage from ice formation and moisture penetration, while the cottage's plastered walls remained sound and dry. The lime coating had developed the hardness Santos predicted, actually becoming more durable with each season of weathering. Thomas documented the complete moisture protection system in his building journal, noting that water management required attention to every detail from site grading to roof design. The cottage had evolved into a complete environmental control system that managed heat, airflow, and moisture as integrated elements rather than separate problems. The winter of 1886 to 1887 arrived with a ferocity that caught the entire Great Basin unprepared. Snow began falling in early November, and continued with only brief breaks through March, piling to depths not seen in living memory. Temperatures plunged to 25 degrees below freezing and stayed there for weeks, while fierce winds drove the snow into drifts that blocked roads and isolated entire settlements. Across the Western Territories, this would be remembered as the winter that destroyed the open-range cattle industry and broke homesteaders who had thought themselves secure. In Fountain Green, the crisis struck every household differently depending on their building choices made years earlier. Thomas's cottage, now in its 11th winter, faced the ultimate test of his integrated systems under conditions that pushed conventional construction to complete failure. The challenge was not just extreme cold, but the duration of the emergency and the impossibility of obtaining additional fuel or making repairs once the storm cycle began. The Jensens, who had built a large frame house with generous windows in 1881, found themselves retreating first to their kitchen, then to a single room where they moved their beds around the cook stove. Even burning fence posts and furniture, they could not keep the entire house warm enough for habitation. Ice formed on the interior walls of unused rooms, and the family's food supplies froze solid in unheated areas. By February, Mrs. Jensen had developed a persistent cough that worsened in the cold bedrooms, forcing the entire family to sleep on the kitchen floor near the failing stove. The Olsons, in a balloon frame house built to territorial standards in 1879, burned through their entire winter wood supply by January and began dismantling their barn for fuel. The thin walls and large window openings created convection currents that pulled warm air away from the living areas faster than their oversized stove could replace it. Condensation from cooking and breathing froze on windows and walls, creating ice formations that never melted during the coldest weeks. Thomas's cottage faced the same brutal conditions, but responded with the integrated performance that 10 years of refinement had created. The thick adobe walls, charged with heat from controlled evening fires, coasted through even the longest nights above freezing. The stone cellar maintained steady temperatures that kept root vegetables and preserved foods in perfect condition while preventing the kitchen floor from conducting ground cold into the living space. The lime-plastered exterior shed snow and ice without structural damage, while the extended eaves prevented moisture penetration even during the worst blizzards. Most critically, the cottage's fuel efficiency proved decisive during the emergency. While neighbors burned 4 to 6 cords per winter under normal conditions and faced fuel exhaustion during the extended cold, Thomas's family maintained comfort with their standard allocation of 3 cords through the entire crisis. This meant they had reserve fuel when others were breaking up buildings, and they avoided the dangerous practice of burning green wood or inappropriate materials that created chimney fires and filled houses with smoke. The cottage's compact design eliminated the waste that plagued larger houses during extreme weather. Every room remained usable throughout the winter, providing full access to storage areas, workspaces, and sleeping quarters that families in conventional houses had to abandon to conserve fuel. The attic bedroom, warmed by the central chimney and insulated by thermal mass, stayed comfortable enough for the children even on the coldest nights. When spring finally arrived, the performance differences became starkly visible across Fountain Green. Several frame houses showed structural damage from repeated freeze-thaw cycles, with cracked foundations, warped siding, and damaged roofing from ice buildup. The Jensen house required extensive repairs to water-damaged interior walls where condensation and ice formation had rotted plaster and wooden framing. 2 families had to rebuild outbuildings that had been dismantled for emergency fuel. The cottage emerged from the ordeal with only minor maintenance needs. The lime plaster required patching in a few areas where wind-driven snow had caused minor erosion, but the adobe core remained sound and dry. The stone foundation showed no signs of frost damage or settlement, while the extended eaves had successfully protected the walls from the worst of the weather. Most remarkably, the integrated systems had continued functioning normally throughout the crisis, requiring no emergency modifications or extraordinary measures. The community's attitude toward Thomas's methods shifted dramatically after this demonstration. The same neighbors who had mocked mud brick construction now sought detailed advice on adobe building techniques, thermal mass design, and fuel-efficient heating systems. The Danish mason who had supported Thomas's early experiments found himself in demand throughout the valley as families planned replacements for damaged structures. Local builders began incorporating elements of Thomas's approach into new construction projects. The Fountain Green Brickyard expanded adobe production to meet growing demand from customers who now understood the practical advantages of thermal mass in extreme climates. Stonemasons found steady work creating elevated foundations that would protect earthen walls from ground moisture, while carpenters learned to design extended eaves and central chimney placement for maximum heat retention. The territorial government took notice of the cottage's performance when officials surveyed winter damage across Utah settlements. Engineers documenting building failures and successes noted that thick-walled construction with proper moisture protection had consistently outperformed conventional frame buildings in extreme weather. These observations would influence building recommendations for future frontier settlements in harsh climates. Thomas began receiving visitors from other Great Basin communities, planning new construction projects. A delegation from Nevada's Carson Valley spent several days studying the cottage's integrated systems, taking detailed measurements of wall thickness, foundation height, and eave extensions. They were particularly interested in the seasonal operating procedures that maximized thermal mass performance and the water management details that had prevented structural damage. Word of the cottage's success spread through Mormon settlements across the territory, carried by church leaders who had witnessed the comparative performance during the crisis winter. Brigham Young University's engineering faculty incorporated thermal mass principles into their curriculum after studying documentation of the cottage's fuel efficiency and structural durability. The practical knowledge that Thomas had assembled from indigenous techniques, immigrant crafts, and frontier innovation was becoming recognized as a superior approach to Great Basin construction. The cottage had proven that buildings designed to work with natural forces rather than against them could provide better performance with fewer resources. Thomas's integration of thermal mass, controlled airflow, and moisture management had created a system that delivered superior comfort and reliability while requiring less fuel, maintenance, and emergency intervention than conventional construction. The hard winter had transformed his experimental approach into validated frontier technology that would influence building practices across the American West.